Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring one of the quintessential smoking gun pieces of evidence for the Tartaria theory, and that is the mud flood. The mud flood, it is really the smoking gun because there are a lot of variations of the evidence that indicate that some sort of mud flood occurred. Naturally, the mainstream has a variety of interesting responses to this theory, and even though there is a wide variety of evidence, which ranges from images, of course, we know what we can say about images and how they can be altered, yet we also have actual structures that we can look at and examine, and ascertain that something happened to them that indicates that they were mud flooded. Not images, but structures that you can really go and look at today and determine may have been subjected to some sort of forces which involved the land changing, the ground being liquefied, or liquefaction as it's called, and that liquefaction spreading all over the land in many different locations. The intention of this exploration is to examine what caused the mud flood, and then why did it happen. However, we're going to conduct this exploration with a different approach. We are going to intentionally look at what the skeptics say about the mud flood and how they respond to the theory of Tartaria. It's always very interesting and I'll admit somewhat entertaining to do, but I think it's important to consider the views of others, because if you just dismiss the views of others, then oftentimes that's the very antithesis of the true scientific approach. And if you look at these images of the mud flood, these are no doubt the most dramatic images, and of course these are constructed. Yet at the same time, we have many photos and are well aware of many buildings that have very deep foundations that defy simple explanation. You may have seen the Salt Lake Temple in Utah, and you can think of many other buildings that you've seen in the course of your travels that suddenly have these signs of being mud-flooded buildings. We're also going to look at a couple in this exploration. So let's start by examining what the skeptics have to say about the mud flood. Now let's take a look and see what the skeptics have to say about Tartaria and the mud flood, from this article by Brian Dunning. And don't worry, we'll be taking a look at his biography here at the end of the article. Filed under history and pseudo-history and natural history. And we know what they mean when they say pseudo, don't we? Yes. Oh, apparently you can subscribe to this on a podcast and listen on Apple and listen on Spotify. Well, it's a written article, so rather than subjecting you to that, I think I'll just read it and we'll examine it. Lovely picture, and you can see why I selected this picture. It's a great picture that depicts a potential mud flood. But let's see what our self-described skeptic has to tell us. In recent years, a new alternative world history claim has arisen from the internet, as though the internet's some sort of self-aware entity, and it's a doozy. It revolves around an alleged worldwide cataclysm believed by adherents to have taken place sometime in the 1800s, a disaster that wiped out a worldwide advanced civilization and allowed the nations as we know them today to rise up. The event was a mud flood, in quotations, in which several meters of mud washed in and buried the ground levels of houses and buildings everywhere. Those cities and towns that were partially buried constituted the worldwide advanced civilization called Tartaria, which had free wireless energy and was populated, at least in part, by giants. So he's taking parts of the theory and suggesting that that's what applies to everybody, naturally. It was a civilization reset. Out with the old, in with the new, and that new civilization is us. If this sounds too silly to be worth anyone's time to even listen to, then consider the fact that of all the hundreds of topic suggestions in the Skeptoid key, this is the one that I chose for this week, and I chose it for good reason. So attend. Interesting that he has to convince his own followers to listen, but I understand. It's all about a convincing game, isn't it? Especially when we're talking about skeptics. Let us begin by surveying the evidence put forth for what some adherents call mud flood theory, and this takes us about 12 seconds to do. Brian, you're showing us what a brilliant mind that you have and telling us that you're going to dismiss this in 12 seconds. You're not even going to consider it. So we know that you're based on hard beliefs. Well, let's see what takes 12 seconds to cover the mud flood theory. Find any old-timey black and white photo where people are digging, particularly if there's an old steam shovel or mule teams being employed, and it doesn't even matter what they're digging, you can say they're digging out from the great depth of mud that covered their city. Then find any modern photograph of any old building that has floors below grade, especially if it has basement windows peeking out, or if there's excavation going on next door, which has exposed its basement walls or foundations, and say that the building's lower levels were obviously buried by mud. I don't want to sound dismissive, but that is indeed the entirety of the evidence that has motivated these people to discard all of known history and embrace this alternative version. You know what, Brian? You are absolutely right, because all of known history is verified and certified by multiple sources, and none of them have ever gotten anything wrong, have they? Despite the fact that our government was preceded by numerous governments that we're told are corrupt. But that's okay, Brian. I'm with you on this one, okay? I can follow you. As far as the previous civilization being named Tartaria goes, this part is more interesting. As you may or may not know, Tartars was the generic name used by Europeans up until the middle of the 19th century for the people who inhabited the largely unexplored regions of Asia, including what we now know as Manchuria, Siberia, and Central Asia. Many pre-20th century world maps showed these regions labeled simply as Tartary. Actually, you can find many maps that call it Tartaria, but that's all right. We'll ignore that. And as geographical knowledge gradually increased, Manchurian Mongolia became Chinese Tartary, Siberia became Great Tartary, and Central Asia became Independent Tartary. So again, ignore all those maps that say Tartaria on them. Good call there, Brian. These placeholder names quickly dropped out of use as the true place names and nations became known. However, today most people have no idea that such a large part of the world was called Tartary relatively recently. Really? And when you watch YouTube videos showing so many old maps boldly labeling Central Eurasia with an unfamiliar name, it can be pretty surprising. In fact, it can be so surprising that it might leave a person open to an astounding explanation for it, such as mud flood theory. Interesting in all this diatribe, I haven't seen any actual refuting of this. Well, maybe he'll get to it. I hesitate to overuse the term conspiracy theory. Ooh, there he goes. Because it's often misused to refer to anything from UFO stories to urban legends to actual conspiracies. So Brian is admitting that there are actual conspiracies. Well, that's good to know. But this is indeed one. Of course it is, because you disagree with it, so you label it a conspiracy theory. You're following, Brian. Believers claim that this ancient history of Tartaria as an advanced civilization and of the mud flood that destroyed it are covered up by today's world governments. They conspire to keep it a secret and to keep historians teaching a false history, the version you and I know. Because, of course, it can't be false history because it's what you know, Brian, right? I agree. The reason for this is not at all made clear so far as I could find, but nevertheless, a conspiracy theory it is. Tartaria and the mud flood is truly a 21st century conspiracy theory, in that it exists almost entirely on the internet, if not entirely. That's funny. It doesn't exist on the internet when I go out and I do my explorations in person and the people that I collaborate with face to face, but that's all right. He's making broad sweeping comments and you can't blame him for doing that. While some parts of the narrative go back centuries, and we'll talk about those, the whole thing as a single consolidated claim only goes back to around 2017. Yes, Brian knows exactly where it all started. Of course he does. August of 2016 is when the first videos began to appear on YouTube about the mud flood idea, and we know this because of tools such as Google Trends. Yes, those good old Google Trends. They will tell you everything, won't they? This is a tool that allows you to see the popularity of specific Google search terms over time, because there's no other search engine, right? And there's no other means of acquiring information. And nobody goes to the library in person. No, not at all. When we search for mud flood or mud flood theory or Tartaria, and again, he doesn't acknowledge that that term is actually seen on the maps, but why should he? We learn that the internet was essentially devoid of any interest in these things until about December of 2018. That is completely untrue, but that's okay. You can just say whatever you want to. Ever since then, there has been mounting interest in those subjects among internet users. Now, it is true. It has spread across the internet. But that's the whole point of the internet. And you have to wonder, is this something that was originally intended to be misinformation, but now it's gone too far? We can compare and contrast what happened in the 1970s with all of the alternative research, which a lot of people probably correctly summarize is information that was intentionally released to the public to mislead them. But there was never any sort of hitting the brakes really hard in the 1980s or 1990s. They just sort of let all these alternative research theories sort of die out and disprove them over time or claim that they did and just Some of them they let linger. YouTube is what drives a lot of these pop culture trends on the internet, so we should expect that when we go to YouTube and do a search for videos on those subjects that were posted in that date range, we're probably going to find at least one early influential video. Long-time Skeptoid listeners might remember that this is exactly how we found the original YouTube upload that constituted the case zero for the Finland does not exist conspiracy theory. Interesting. I haven't heard of that one myself, but so be it. Applying the same methodology here, I did find a YouTube user, Philip Drugenin, who had been posting videos about a mud flood since August of 2016. At first, there wasn't much interest in his videos. They had very low viewership, that is, until December 2018, January 2019. And what exactly changed? The same time that Google Trends reported the internet became aware of the subject. Because Google Trends were able to ascertain that. Intriguing. Drugenin had an enormous spike in his downloads right at that time. Which one triggered which? I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. Lots of conspiracy theorists have made mud flood videos, and it makes no difference who was the lucky one to get the early traction. What matters is that this is when the subject first became a thing. Yes, because no one ever did alternative research. No one ever had alternative theories in the history of humanity, right, Brian? Of course not. But taking Drugenin's YouTube channel just as one representative example, the descriptions on his videos and his Facebook postings indicate run-of-the-mill, broad-spectrum conspiracy mongering. Isn't it interesting how he says conspiracy mongering and doesn't say conspiracy theory mongering? Because remember, conspiracies are legitimate. And of course, we have the usual suspects that he alludes to that everyone always tries to assign to anybody who does alternative research, because that's one of the easiest ways to discredit such things and to make sure people are not thinking what they're not supposed to be thinking. Make no mistake, Tartaria and the mud flood does not come from historians or archaeologists or geologists. It comes from the darkest underbelly of internet conspiracy theory culture. Thus, we might be tempted to stop here and say that it's not worth the trouble of a debunking. And in many cases, that would be correct. But here we're seeing an almost unbelievable growth in popularity. Look at any of the videos or search any of the forums where mud flood theory is discussed, and you'll see that a depressing number of people fully embrace it. So here's what it all boils down to. Here's his true thesis. People are not thinking the way they're supposed to be thinking, and he's here to put a stop to it. The number of YouTube videos promoting it as fact continues to rise, and some of them have download counts in the millions. So let this episode, in particular its transcript page with the high Google ranking according to all Skeptoid episode transcript pages, so now we're just talking about numbers and that proves everything. Where have I heard that before? Serve as an alternative destination for those using the internet to seek out more information on Tartaria and the mud flood. Yes, the Skeptoid site seems very legitimate. Now, obviously, it requires little more than awareness of the existence of basements and sub-basements to accept many of these photographs without being forced to throw out all of world history and insist upon the existence of an ancient advanced civilization. Watching the YouTube videos, I recognize at least one other photograph as depicting a time when Seattle raised some of its street levels, burying many first floors in the process, in order to reduce the steepness of some of the city's hills. Yes, and these are videos that have been covered quite extensively by other researchers. Why don't we take a break here from Brian's brilliant account here and take a look at some photos of Seattle from the time frame that he's talking about. Let's step back here from the skeptic's perception and let's try to look at things a little bit more objectively. In other words, just looking at things and using our own minds instead of just abiding by what Brian here tells us we're supposed to think. All right, so let's just look at this account of flattening hills to build Seattle, 1905 to 1930. Now, as you look at these images, remember, we are told that this was all something that was done in the following account. Starting in 1897 and continuing through 1930, the hilly topography of central Seattle was radically altered by a series of regrades in what might have been the largest such alteration of urban terrain at the time. Probably it's still the largest such alteration of urban terrain ever. But why let that stop us? The regrading strategy was adopted for one main reason: economics. The idea was that reshaping the land would open up the city to more commerce. The earliest urban planners for the city believed that if the streets were at regular angles and at a level elevation, business would thrive. Interesting. Engineers and workers moved mountains, straightened rivers, leveled hillsides, dug sewers, paved roads, and carved canals as part of making Seattle. As Clarence Bagley wrote in his 1916 History of Seattle, "No great city on the American continent has overcome so many natural obstacles encountered in its growth. Seattle Bagley concluded, was literally one vast reclamation project. You know what? I'm thinking Bagley was being quite honest when he said it was a vast reclamation project. These regrading projects began after the 1889 fire that destroyed much of Seattle's downtown retail district. Of course, it always starts with a fire. After the blaze, city engineer R.H. Thompson initiated an ambitious plan to reinvigorate the city. He convinced the municipal government to level hills, fill tidelands, straighten the Duwamish River, and purchase the Cedar River watershed. Most of these projects were completed between 1890 and 1930, when Seattle matched Bagley's description of a city under near constant construction. Now, when you look at these photos, do these photos really paint the picture of constant construction? Do you really think that something like this kind of excavation project would be possible even today if we devoted the resources of the entire state of Washington, or for that matter, the entire West Coast? Or why stop there? The entire United States of America devoted every single excavator, every single worker it had. Do you think this would be possible to do in this timeline now if this was attempted? And then, for that matter, why don't cities do this now? I mean, if that's all you need to do to increase property value and economics, then just do this kind of work. Look at the cool things that you can do and achieve at this time frame. And Brian Dunning doesn't question this. To him, these photos are solid proof that this unfolded exactly as we're told. It doesn't matter that it doesn't make sense, and the how is irrelevant. You don't ask questions when you're Brian Dunning. You accept everything as you are told. So what do you think of Brian Dunning's assertion that this was simply a massive earth-moving project in Seattle? Yes, it took him a few decades, but do you really think it's practicable? And one thing I'll say is I don't think Brian Dunning would ever ask you questions. He's going to tell you what to think, and you better think what he tells you to think. It's the word, and it's good because it comes from Brian Dunning. Moving on. Similar earth-moving projects have been undertaken in cities all around the world, particularly in the decades around the turn of the 20th century, when streetcars and automobiles quite suddenly came into wide use and required regrading in areas that were already developed. Yes, like New York City, for example. Manhattan had to do a massive regrading project, didn't they? This is one reason you can go to virtually any large old city and find underground tours and such. You see, it's got a rational explanation. It was all just the regrading. The regrading is how they established the subway system in New York City, right? Given these few facts about urban buildings, there remains no evidence at all that anything like a worldwide mud flood buried cities everywhere. Of course not, Brian, because you said so. I know better than to question you. Now this gets better. Quizzically, interesting word there, many of the photographs I found in the YouTube videos and web forums depict Robert Wadlow. Yeah, we depicted him in an earlier video last week, didn't we? The tallest person in history at 272 centimeters, 8 feet 11, who died in 1940. His identity is never given on these web pages. I recognized him simply because he's easily recognizable and his photos are generally well known. But I couldn't figure out what the conspiracy theorists might thought he had to do with the mud flood. Wadlow was born in 1918 and died quite young, so his photos show him with antique cars, clothing, and street scenes. Recalling that the mud flood is claimed to have happened in the 1800s, my guess is that these photos appear to some undereducated people, because you're not undereducated, no, not at all, to be from about that time period, thus making Wadlow one of the giants who lived in Tartaria. Photos of other people affected with gigantism are also shown, always old black and white photos. It seems clear that the believers considered photos of Wadlow and others like him to be the Tartarian giants that populated the earth prior to their presumed demise in the mud flood. Now, official statement from this channel, there may have been giants, there may not have been giants. We just don't know. But you're not going to see anything like that in this kind of article. You are going to be told exactly what to think, and you're not going to be asked what you think because that's not important. Paradoxically, it's this introduction of a maximally implausible story element like giants, because Earth moving in a short amount of time in cities all across the world is not an implausible story. No, that makes perfect sense, right? Like giants that gives Tartaria and the mud flood its closest thing to an element of legitimacy. This is because stories of giants actually are ancient. And then he goes about to talk about the texts of virtually every culture throughout history regarding giants, and quite accurately so. And we've talked about that on the channel before. To a lesser extent, the whole idea of a great flood that resets civilization is another way believers try to link this particular claim to the classics. I say to a lesser extent because legendary floods like that of Noah were said to truly obliterate everything, while this new alleged mud flood simply dumped a meter or two of mud around buildings and was relatively easily removed by workers shown in old photographs. This raises a few points that are not very persuasively argued, in my opinion. Yes, it is your opinion, at least you're being honest there. For example, why did burying only the ground floors of buildings cause society to lose its advanced technology, like free wireless energy? Why did it kill only all the giants, presumably the only people tall enough to have not been buried by it? Where did all this mud come from and where did it go? Why was the alleged nation of Tartaria the only one that did not survive? Why did the Tartarian giants live in houses and buildings the same size as ours? Yeah, he's really doing the hand wave, isn't he? If all the world's nations are conspiring to cover this up, why are so many YouTubers and bloggers allowed to freely reveal everything without consequences? You know what? That's actually a great question, and I'll address it right now. Because when you have confusion and when you have uncertainty, people tend to adhere to authority, and they will do as they are told. That is exactly why it's allowed to happen. And it also gives a little bit of legitimacy to it. Besides, why would you be saying that, Brian? I mean, isn't that what your entire Skeptoid site is based on, is shooting down these crazed conspiracy theories, as you call them? But then you also call them conspiracy. So which is it? You do know the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory, right? And you do know that only a scientist or a historian is officially certified to tell us what the difference is between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Okay, I digress. And of course, the perennial question for all such conspiracy theories, oh, there he goes, what exactly are all today's national leaders gaining by covering up this event? But let us not push these questions too hard for fear of collapsing the card house that is Tartaria and the mud flood. Oh, and he even signs it. Great signature there. What's this Brian Dunning character even look like, I wonder? Oh, that's an interesting picture of him. Here we go. Here's what he looks like. Brian Dunning. I'm a science writer and author. So he's not a scientist, he's a science writer, which means journalist. And also the executive director of Skeptoid Media. This whole site is mostly my gig. I have a press page here, and my personal site is here. You can also follow me on Twitter, and all the other social media stuff too. Oh, that sounds like the internet, but I thought the internet was this entity that was generating all these crazy conspiracy theories. Okay, never mind. I live in Bend, Oregon, and can be found sometimes inside my Jeep, but often underneath it. Well, that's an interesting little bio. For the record, I don't bear any ill will towards Mr. Brian Dunning. I just find his approach a little peculiar. He wants to assert in his article that anyone who doesn't think the way he thinks must be undereducated and they must be fools. And you'll see that same approach from anybody who doesn't want to consider any alternative methods of thinking or even theories. There's only one way you're supposed to think, and if you don't think that way, then you're going to be classified a fool or undereducated, as was stated in the article. I'm fully willing to concede that it is possible that what Brian Dunning stated in his article could have happened. I don't think it's very likely. I find it very difficult to believe, or perhaps there's some other option or theory that's in between the mud flood and what he asserts is just a city that was conducting some massive landscaping projects for a couple decades because, they just had nothing better to do and had infinite resources, because that's kind of what you have to accept. But maybe it's something else in between. I would never insult Brian Dunning, and I would certainly never question his education level. I'm sure he would give me the same consideration if he was aware of what theories I assert. I think I recognize Brian Dunning, and this picture looks familiar in some way. He bears a striking resemblance to Dick Jones from the first RoboCop movie. But let's be honest, Ronnie Cox is still with us, and he's doing great, the actor who portrayed Dick Jones. Maybe somebody else? Oh, Patrick McGoogan from The Prisoner. Yes, he bears a very striking resemblance to Patrick McGoogan. The wonderful 1960s TV series The Prisoner, which Patrick McGoogan starred in as the secret agent who was seized by an unknown entity and forced to endure brainwashing experiments as they tried to find out why he resigned. It would never work, though, with Brian Dunning in The Prisoner. For one, he would never resign from a government agency as a secret agent. And two, even if he did find himself in the village to be brainwashed and tortured to find out what he knew, he would probably give in right away because he'd see himself as a deviant and he needed to be cured. Therefore, he would simply submit to all the terrifying procedures that they wanted to do on him, and the show would be over in about 5 minutes. No, let's cut right to the chase here. Brian Dunning is Dr. Zaius, Minister of Science and Chief Defender of the Faith. Yes, those roles are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're mutually inclusive. This is someone who is certified and accredited to tell you exactly what to think. And there is no debating what they think. And you dare not go against what they tell you is the good word. Because if you try to counter any point that they make, you'll find yourself facing a grand tribunal. Mr. Dunning will be leading this tribunal with two of his cronies on either side, and they'll give you this kind of image. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. You are not allowed to make any sort of counterpoint, and what he says is the good word. Therefore it is truth, and therefore it cannot be questioned, because he's also a labeled skeptic, much as Dr. Zaius was. And then after you face your tribunal and you're found guilty, you will then have to spend some personal time with him, and he will grant you the grand extolling of all of his great historical knowledge and his understanding of how things truly are, and he will insult you relentlessly. And then you'll be reminded of what your proper place in society is. So leaving Dr. Zaius behind, we have to consider the fact that soil liquefaction is something that really happens. It's very well documented. Naturally, we'll be given a variety of reasons for why it happens, why soil behaves like a liquid. It's due to something in the ground. It's an earthquake. It's a natural process. It only happens in isolated incidences. Yet we see many different examples of it, and we see buildings such as this that have been stuck in the ground for a very long time. Of course, we'll be told it's well documented and was merely the result of an earthquake that turned the soil into liquid. There is no other explanation for it. Do not trust your eyes, trust what we're telling you. But how many images do we have to see? How many accounts do we have to read before we start to ask questions? Dr. Zaius will tell us that we're just supposed to think exactly as he's told to think, or as we're told to think, and not ask questions. However, there's just too many examples to where we can't afford to ask questions, because then we're just simply accepting things at face value, which is exactly what Dr. Zaius wants, and I'm not one to go along with Dr. Zaius. We see so many images with so many different buildings that have the clear signs that they've been subjected to traumatic forces. We also see different types of markings on the wall, and we'll be given a variety of reasons. We'll typically be told this is natural erosion, or these are the forces of nature, and not the forces of some sort of mud flood. That's just absurd. Yet, how many different examples do you need to see? How many different accounts do we need to read before we start to see that we simply can't continuously dismiss it, no matter how much we're insulted or how much we're threatened? And that's really where the crux of this research comes from. A building such as this, that really gives you the classic example of a mud flood. And I chose this innocuous building intentionally because it has all the classic signs. Yet you can find mud flood buildings just about everywhere you look. Of course, it'll be dismissed by people like Dr. Zaius as saying that you're simply looking for things that aren't really there. But I ask you, what's your impression when you see this image? When you see this done to a building, do you really think that this is something that was just the result of some sort of excavation that occurred? Or that there's no reason for an explanation on this building for why this looks like this? Are you willing to just let it go, and does it really not matter because there's other more important things in life to pursue? Or is having awareness important, and being willing to ask questions and really seek your own answers and determine your own theories? That's actually the very heart of what being an explorer truly is. It's not being afraid to seek your own answers. And there are many people, led by Dr. Zaius and many others, who don't want you to even seek your own answers. And they will gladly insult you, and they will happily mock you. And let them. Because at the end of the day, when you're able to find your own answers, this is how you're able to truly find out who you really are and come to your own answers. What's the real end game of this alternative research? Well, the end game really comes down to the fact that we need to achieve self-awareness, and we need to find what it is that makes us truly unique. And everyone out there will try to tell us that we're not unique. And in fact, the very science fiction film that I referenced Dr. Zaius from, it even tried to tell us that human beings are not so great and the apes are always better. Although, to be fair to the entire series, it did show that the apes had many of the same tendencies to engage in violence and inflicting in self-harm. So what's my theory for how the mud flood happened and why? You might recall an exploration that we did early in the channel concerning Holy Hill in Wisconsin. This is a cathedral that they call a basilica, the terms seem to be interchangeable, but a very large and well-built church that's on a hill in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. It's far outside the outer suburbs of Milwaukee. And yet, when we look closely at this cathedral, this basilica, this church, we see the usual construction cues, the large towers, the beautiful window. We see potentially the ability to project some other form of technology, some other form of sound, or the process that's been brought up a couple times on previous live streams of the channel called cymatics. Cymatics are a subset of modal vibrational phenomena. We don't exactly know what causes them, but it shows in these different patterns. Could this be something to do with sound or some technology we don't understand that was emitted through sound from these once great cathedrals, these churches that we see? And this can cause these patterns. Perhaps another application of this technology is that it caused the actual soil liquefaction on a level we couldn't possibly understand. Consider all the churches that you see. The churches that are on a hill, the churches that are in large cities or in great municipalities. And yet at the same time, churches are not just confined to large cities with their incredible organs, their towers, and their amazing windows, which we speculate could be used to project some form of vibrational frequencies. We see churches in every small town and village. There's even a small town called Arcadia in western Iowa that's never had a population of more than 500 in its entire recorded history since 1880, and yet it has two very large churches, both on hills. Everywhere we look across the land, you'll see that there are churches or buildings that we're told have a religious function, and yet there's many similarities in the layouts. Towers and windows and incredible construction. We're told and conditioned to believe that these religious edifices are potentially sanctuaries or places where one could seek a sanctuary, and you'll find it in different forms of fiction, that churches are a place of holy ground, just as other religious edifices in the other faiths across the land are. Yet at the same time, is it possible that all these churches survived because they were meant to? That they were positioned in a location to where they could broadcast the frequency or induce cymatics? That somehow their original purpose of defense for the old civilization was subverted or sabotaged, and they were used to induce the mud flood? That's one very solid theory, and I think the numerous locations of these religious edifices across the land and their unique personal locations, oftentimes on hills or in, how shall you say, commanding positions on the terrain, they could have very easily broadcast these frequencies and caused this breakdown of the soil or this soil liquefaction using some process of cymatics, some process of vibrational frequencies that we don't understand. Even the great Cathedral of Cologne, that thing survived 2 world wars. It seems as though these buildings were meant to last and endure. And it's very difficult to find even an unused church, and granted I'm just talking about the United States here and more recent experiences, that's ever been torn down. If a church is unused, the building remains standing. And of course, what do you have inside every church? You have a very large and impressive organ. It seems as though it's the layout of projecting sound. And this goes for the edifices of other faiths as well. Projecting sound seems to be very important. Now, granted, this is just a theory. It could be wrong. And yet, every time you go around and you see the layout of these religious buildings being similar, with the ability to project sound or in some way influence vibrational frequency, then that really gives a lot of credence to the fact that this was how the mud flood was induced. And why was the mud flood induced? Simple. Because if you have a mud flood, it makes it a lot easier to reset the civilization. It enables you to conceal the greatness of the buildings. It also allows a different civilization to control exactly what's going to be released and what's not going to be shared with the general population. And perhaps it was an initial attempt to destroy the enclaves of the population that did not go along with the reset. But there are many theories. What are your theories? Please let me know what you think in the comments. And yes, I want to know what you think, and yes, it is perfectly okay to disagree with me. Please let me know.
But we can't be sure.
He is. He knew all the time, long before you found your cave. He knew. Defender of the faith, guardian of the terrible secret. That's it, isn't it, Doctor?
Consider joining the channel as a member. You can be an explorer and receive early access to content, or you can be a Prime Explorer and have exclusive content that you can't watch on the regular channel. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me today.